Bridging is an idea both vast and multifaceted. When it came to conversations about the survival and thriving of focusing, bridging was crucial in Gene's view. One aspect of what he said he meant was that people with focusing skills who know people with skills in another practice should connect and somehow mix together what they know. This was part of a larger context he saw in which focusing should be combined with other practices. He always meant focusing and, said he. A variation on the theme of bridging was what Gene called bridging the sames, connecting people working on the same things, but who are not yet connected to each other. He repeated how important it was to help people with the terminology they needed to communicate what they know. He used the term nodes to mean an instance of a person or a few people who have a practice. Existing nodes would be groups of people involved in the same practice, but who are not acquainted with the other groups in the same practice. He wanted to share widely his ideas about how to talk, for example, in a focusing group that you don't belong to, and bridge the group you belong to with that group. This could be done by asking them something, telling them something, announcing or offering something. He would say things like, asking what's new helps a little bit. This he saw as a monthly activity, and he saw it as something essential to the survival and thriving of focusing. Then there were what Gene called new nodes. New nodes was how he described entering a network where a focuser either knows the practice but does not yet belong, or does not know the practice, where the person would introduce and teach focusing. Gene discussed how to talk with people in a group which has another interest/skill set other than focusing, and make them aware of and want to try out focusing so as to combine it with their practice. This is bridging different practices. Gene described his idea of nodes as a key to spreading focusing and joining focusing with other practices. Gene talked a lot about bridging during our time together, and particularly in the online conversations he held for large audiences. Although I was not in attendance at all those conversations, I know from the lists of volunteers collected that Gene generated a lot of interest in bridging in these audiences. What did not come through was the next steps, exactly what to say in the circumstances he described. A side note, I often hear bridging used as if it means the same as crossing. For me, these are two separate and distinct terms. Bridging is for me as described above. Crossing for me is as described in TAE, holding the felt sense of something and from there sensing into, looking out toward, something else to see what new forms. It is for each of us to decide the meaning that resonates best, but I add this note in case the reader, like me, notices the difference. Making a living with focusing. There is a conversation to be had among people who have succeeded at bridging either or both of existing nodes and new nodes, and people who would like to try. One of the things I noticed in my time working with Gene and after was the dynamic tension that exists between wanting to spread the practice and wanting to develop something individually, particularly if the developer expects to make a living out of the business they are creating. Survival needs can interfere with collaborative efforts. I believe this was one of the forces Gene did not fully reckon with in his thinking and screaming. As a sort of epilogue to bridging, Gene wanted to build an infrastructure of implementers and achievers. He wanted to collect and empower people who have the means to build infrastructures in organizations and communities with focusing embedded throughout. He needed a lot more input than he would ever obtain to approach any how to do this ideas, but it is worth memorializing that he said he wanted this very much. Focusing and. Gene brought the idea of bridging to a personal level. I never saw a full accounting, but I believe there were hundreds of people who reached out to connect with him. Of course, he could not reply to all of them. Sometimes he would pass one to me. While I was working with Gene, there was an instance of bridging focusing with sports that was mentioned. Gene wanted me to contact the person or persons involved. Gene told me that a coordinator in Spain had mentioned a man who was combining focusing and teaching tennis. That was one of two instances. The other was focusing and executive leadership, where I was not able to reach the person while I was working with Gene. These two instances were memorable because in both I made contact much later and quite by accident. In the case of focusing and teaching tennis, I helped the tennis instructor present a roundtable which was hosted by TIFI to expand the conversation. In the case of focusing and executive leadership, I met the professor who had originally contacted Gene and benefited from a couple of years of peer coaching. In that case, I confirmed something many may suspect. Focusing is an embedded practice in places we might never realize, except when the practitioners make themselves known. I think Gene would smile. For me, I remain in awe of how Gene connected me to at least two people with whom I shared significant common ground. Research. Gene and I had several discussions about the need for professionally acceptable research studies, showing verifiable, repeatable, and predictable proof of the benefits of focusing relative to a variety of fields. Gene was convinced that success stories were all that was needed. I disagreed and still do. Our discussions centered around valid research, how to produce such work, and the need to create a review board and publish in academic publications, which would lead to more credibility for focusing. Gene said there are two kinds of research, real and not so real. There is research, by which Gene said he meant success stories, demonstrating the effectiveness of focusing through reports of successful applications. But this view is missing several of the essential features of credible or valid research. 1. Measurable outcomes. 2. Repeatable and predictable results. 3. Academic/scientific rigor. 4. Clear connections of relevance to real life. 5. Peer review. 6. Publication and/or presentation. The Gendlin Research Center has since been established, and much good has come from their endeavors. Still, for areas where academic or scientific standards apply, a body of research that meets those standards is badly needed. For example, in the world of focusing and public education, without rigorous research on the measurable benefits of focusing for students, it is nearly impossible to convince academics in fields like social and emotional learning, curriculum development, and teacher education to pay attention. I write this from direct personal experience. Strengthening TFI management team. Gene had a scream about strengthening the leadership of TFI. He wanted both the executive director and the managing director to have more help, but he did not know, other than more people like me, how that could be possible. What follows are my recollections of some of the facets of this topic that Gene wanted to bring to fruition. Gene imagined a variety of officers. He recognized that business people had a lot to offer and contribute to running the institute. He imagined channel directors and a whole project called channel development. Channels were topic areas of business interest like funding, operations, volunteer management, outreach, communications, etc. Another time he referred to groups in different disciplines or practices as nodes in this context. I do not have any notes that further clarify what he meant by nodes, and he used the term differently at different times. but it was clear that he meant to empower more people than the official TFI leadership to act on behalf of TFI. By way of update, I am pleased to note that in 2023, TIFI's board created a position called Board Advisory Member, whose responsibilities resonate with what Gene had in mind with channels. The person who managed the email database once told Gene that there were 4,000 people signed up in TFI's database. Gene's scream became, if there are 4,000 people out there who are interested in focusing, then there are at least 400 who would be interested in working with me. We must contact them. This led to a sub-project where he would invite people to work with him whenever he held a public conversation. Names would be gathered and listed as potential volunteers. This led to another sub-project about how to direct the efforts of volunteers towards projects where they had some applicable skills, knowledge, or experience, which led to another sub-project. This one was about how to manage projects, appoint leaders, assign volunteer staff, and encourage completion of projects. This in turn led to a sub-project about nodes, see above, which had to do with delegating authority to non-board members to manage projects on behalf of Gene, by which he really meant the Focusing Institute. Gene and I had an ongoing conversation that often felt like an argument about what to do with volunteers, how to find out what interested them, how to find out whether they were competent in their areas of interest, how to match them to projects that did not yet exist, and how to manage them effectively and remotely. Gene resisted my many attempts to create some sort of questionnaire or other information-gathering mechanism to try to match volunteers with efforts. I never learned what created this resistance in him. I do know that managing volunteers is both an art and a science, difficult to do well and nearly impossible to do without the right incentives and infrastructure. Gene would most likely be happy to see how TIFI is succeeding with volunteers now. Mapping the global focusing community. Beyond his concerns about strengthening TFI, Gene's idea about mapping was one of what I will call the overarching projects, meaning a project that could feed into all the other projects. Gene was a skilled connector, always wanting people with common interests to get together. If someone was working on focusing with prison inmates, he wanted to connect them to someone doing similar work in another region who did not know about the first person. The map of the global focusing community, he imagined, would support this process of connection. He literally meant to create a map of the globe and put pins in the locations where focusers were pursuing particular activities. As mentioned previously, Gene was also always looking for volunteers, and mapping the community was one of the ways he believed he could collect and use information on who was interested in volunteering, and on what topic, and how to connect them to others with similar interests. Looking back from here, I see something alive in the whole thing about mapping. Imagine a day when you can click on a link and have access to who is doing what and where, using focusing and related practices. And then imagine that map also showing bridges, where focusing is being used in conjunction with other practices. And while we are wishing, let us also imagine this can be done without fear that anyone's livelihood will be stolen from them, so that information flows freely, is maintained timely, and any focuser can still make a good living. Leveraging national organizations. This was Gene's project to bring focusing to the attention of national associations such as teachers, school superintendents, etc. He articulated his belief that focusing had to enter a system from the top to spread throughout. His logic was sound. Teaching focusing to an individual may go no further than that individual. But teaching focusing to the members of a national association can have a trickle-down effect. At the time, I wrote A Simple Design, see EndNote 5, How to Bring Focusing into National Associations and Organizations, which was inspired by this idea of Gene's. I have spent years exploring the entryway for focusing into public education. The development of curricula in social and emotional learning provides the perfect place for focusing to join the other tools in educators' toolkits as they add topics like listening, paying attention, compassion, and empathy to their teaching plans. In the children and focusing community, experts are already employing focusing in schools in other parts of the world than mine. This is encouraging. Their annual conference is the perfect place to share and refine these ideas, create collaborations, and support the spread of focusing to more and more ages and stages. As for me, I am collaborating on bringing focusing into schools, but the way is challenging because of the limits of evidence-based research results. A conversation about succession planning. What follows is neither fish nor fowl. It is neither a project nor a plan, but it is worth memorializing. Succession planning is a natural part of strategic planning. When I arrived on the scene at TFI, I discovered that lots of people thought about succession for Gene, Mary, and the board, but few seemed to know what to do or how to start an official conversation. This inspired me to pursue the topic privately with Gene. What ensued was a multi-part conversation about what would happen after Gene was gone. I asked him whether an endowed chair at a university was a possibility. He replied, "First, I have to publish a book." Since that time, a process model has been published, which meets the needs that Gene described. An endowed chair at a university would require funding. At the time of our discussion over 10 years ago now, Gene estimated $250,000 US was the minimum that would be required. For many, this might be a daunting figure, and it certainly has the feel of something that would overtake all the fundraising TIFI works so hard to accomplish. At the time, as now, I was convinced that there are wealthy patrons of focusing in the world who might admire this project and be happy to fund it. It becomes more feasible in that scenario. Then I consider the question of whether this endowed chair should be in a philosophy department or a psychology department. I am not in any way an expert in the complexities of academic environments where this would take place, but someone is. The University of Chicago is an obvious choice for an endowed chair in the philosophy department. Thinking about this makes me wonder, what was it like to have Eugene Gendlin as one of the professors in the philosophy department? Some of you out there may know the answer to that, or at least know your own answer. Imagine a world where the funds are raised, the chair is endowed, and there is a philosophy department with a Eugene T. Gendlin Distinguished Professor of Philosophy position. As for a psychology department, the candidates seem more likely to be in Japan or Germany, or perhaps on the east or west coast of the United States, or even Canada. The most important thing is a sponsor, someone who is already an established academic who would shepherd this process through to its completion. It will not be for me to pursue the vision of an endowed chair and bring it to fruition, but I hope someone with the right strengths, skills, connections, and commitment will. Gene's contribution to all of humanity deserves that kind of devotion and longevity. Gene's inquiries. What follows are two topics that Gene and I discussed, which were not at the heart of his screams. I call these Gene's inquiries. Topics he talked about a fair amount, but there was never anything you might call actionable for him or me. I mention these here because they are a part of getting to know more about Gene, one of my motivations for this writing. Economics. Gene had a keen interest in the field of economics. It was not so much a project relative to focusing, but it was something he wanted to talk about. I believe he had several people besides me conversant with the topic, but I may have fascinated him because I worked in the economic research group of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York before working with Gene. We did not talk in depth about economics, but he was always looking for more ways to connect to experts on the topic and understand how philosophy, focusing, and economics might intersect. International Association for the Study of Dreams, IASD. Gene's interest in the meaning of dreams from a focusing perspective and his book, Let Your Body Interpret Your Dreams, made him an attractive speaker to the IASD, I imagine. By the time I arrived, he no longer felt able to address them, but had a project on what to do about that, and who could possibly step in. Nothing came of it in my time with him. This may have been one of the aims of his project about nodes. He created such a wealth of knowledge about dreams that perhaps no one person could curate all of it. It is my hope that more has been done since my time with Gene. I know there is at least one person pursuing dream work. I hope there are many others. Have any of them connected with IASD? It would be interesting to know. Conclusion. It is time to bring this piece to a close. As I have said before, my fondest hope is that readers will find in this work some inspiration to move one of their own ideas forward, or to take one of Gene's ideas and actualize it. Gene was always clear that he wanted to make focusing as freely available as possible. There is, of course, an inherent conflict because people must make a living. I believe Gene would be perfectly happy to see people make a living from the implementation of any of his ideas. I believe that is the biggest reason he never wanted to trademark focusing, or any other terminology that would describe the method that could be trademarked, so that it could be used as widely as possible. Others who spent more time with him than me could likely speak in more detail to that point. The conclusion to this memoir is taken from the movie Toy Story. To infinity and beyond. The ideas Gene and I discussed, organized, pored over, planned, schemed, and dreamed can take us to wonderful and in many cases unimagined places, infinity and beyond. For as long as I live, I will be grateful for all my time with Gene, the good, the bad, the challenging, and the inspiring. With this memoir, I hope that the ideas he and I discussed will take on a life of their own, maybe even long after my life is over. In Memoriam. Mary Hendricks Gendlin passed away in 2015, and Gene Gendlin passed away in 2017. I had one more opportunity to talk with them in late 2013, before the reorganization of the Institute took place. And I had one more chance to see Gene, with Gene's friends, the late B.B. Simon, and Gisela Uhl, on Christmas Eve in 2016. I had given B.B. and Gisela a ride to Gene's home from Newark Airport. It was fitting, in that strange way things fit in my time with Gene, that, at the last, he did not remember me. In hindsight, it would have been harder and sadder for me if he had remembered me. I said hello and goodbye briefly as I left B.B. and Gisela to have their visit, and disappeared from Gene's gaze for the last time. What is left in me of my time with Gene, his wisdom, insight, intuition, excitement, frustration, grasp of so much that it is to be human, his screams, his projects, and what I think of as his wishes, have made my life irreversibly better. And I think this inspiration has already and will continue to make life better for those I am able to influence, with the spirit of Gene Gendlin occasionally on my shoulder. Acknowledgements. This writing would not have been possible without, in the first place, Jack Egan and Eleanor Busher, psychotherapists in Pompton Plains, New Jersey. It was Jack who first introduced me to focusing, and Eleanor who taught the first workshop I ever attended, and encouraged my learning and developing a focusing practice of my own. I owe a debt of gratitude to Harbert Rice, the member of the board of directors who invited me to draft a strategic plan for the Focusing Institute, Without this invitation and encouragement, I would likely never have met the Gendlins personally, nor gathered all the valuable experiences and learning from that experience. To the leadership of the Focusing Institute then, and the International Focusing Institute now, I offer a deep bow of gratitude for all that you have shared, not only with me, but with everyone in the global focusing community to keep the practice of focusing available. To my friends and colleagues who have read this piece and offered so much helpful advice, thank you for keeping the faith with me throughout the long years before I was able to put all this in print in a meaningful way. You have asked to remain anonymous, but I know who you are and cherish your gifts. What I have produced is definitely better because of you. Finally, to my editor, Lisa Hodorovich of Quoth the Writer, LLC, and to my mentor, muse, inspiration, and co-conspirator, Anne Safola, a debt of gratitude that can never be repaid for your trust, faith, and unfailing support. Contact the author. Email barbara.j.dickinson@gmail.com. Linktree link appears in the printed essay. This essay is protected by copyright, all rights reserved. Reproduction or distribution without written permission of the author is prohibited. Endnotes. 1. Link to Gendlin Online Library. 2. See Final Report for TFI Board by Barbara Dickinson. 3. See Presentation on Focusing for Interpersonal Conflict Resolution by Barbara Dickinson. 4. I have left identities out of this piece. If the reader has a question about a specific example, please feel free to contact me. 5. See A Simple Design by Barbara Dickinson.